wonder if we could do Ask a Lawyer and what kind of response we would get.
Ooh, ask a lawyer.
I'm just kidding. Please don't do that. That's not what this show is all about.
Well, let me ask you this question. I do have a question for you as a lawyer, if you don't mind.
Yeah, my scope of practice is very narrow.
Yeah.
And you want to be careful if he starts pulling out his calculator here in a second.
Right. Oh, yeah.
But I charge a lot by the hour, so
Well,
I can talk for a long time.
Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, and he was dealing with many problems. And one of the problems that he was dealing with was brethren taking brethren to law. Have you studied that much from your background?
I haven't. It hasn't come up for me personally. It did come up in a congregation where I was attending, where we had somebody bring a lawsuit against another, and it's a peculiar issue that it's. I'm not sure we could deal with it in 12 minutes, much less 12 days. It's a complicated issue when you're thinking about exercising your rights. I mean, there's a lot to be said for somebody asks you for your tunic, you give them your cloak as well. So there's a lot of variables in my mind that goes into that answer. So I don't have a great one line answer of, should you ever sue somebody? If somebody sues you, should you give them your house? It's not that easy. It's a complicated situation.
And what we really get into is 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 6, but brother goeth to law with brother, and that before the unbelievers. And it can to some degree get pretty intensive, but then in other ways, I believe there is some simplicity to this. God's law in the Old Testament certainly had built into it. And let's be clear, we're under New Testament law. We're not under Old Testament law. But the idea of the principles of how we love God, love each other, those continue to exist even in New Testament times. And so under God's civil law of the Old Testament, there were ways to take matters for judgment to others. But Romans chapter 13 tells us in the New Testament that we are now under, as far as civilly, to the powers that be. We have to answer to them. And this concept of render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and live under the laws of the land, we don't really have much choice on. I'll give it a quick answer real quick, is that 1 Corinthians 6 is dealing with matters of spiritual nature, taking it before those that are unbelievers, trying to make determinations and giving it a bad name. And we need to be careful of that at all times.
That's what I was thinking exactly, because he says, I say this to your shame. It is so that there is not a wise man among you, not even one, be able to judge between his brethren. Listen, there was a case in Texas where there was a church building, and there was two different factions that were arguing over what to do with the church building. And instead of going to court, they called a brother who was a judge. He happened to serve as a judge. And he came down and sat with those brethren, and they worked out an agreement. I think then when you get to verse 6, but brother goes to law against brother, and therefore unbelievers, well, I think that's the exact point, is it brings a shame or a blight to the church, because what's that phrase we use? It's like airing your dirty laundry.
Well, 1 John, how are people going to know that we are Jesus?
That we love one another.
There we go, that we love one another. And so if all of a sudden we're going before these unbelievers and look, you're telling us you're of love, and you're having to come to court over this matter.
What kind of love is that?
Yeah. And so it's the shaming that we have. I don't think it's a forbiddance from using the laws of the land when we have to use the laws of the land. I've seen situations like that where somebody says, well, here is a insurance situation, and there happens to be a Christian that works at that agency, and, forbidding. Certainly there's judgment, and that's where verse 7, and I think, Joe, this is kind of what you were hinting at just a minute ago. Why do you not rather suffer yourselves to be defrauded? When we have the right heart, there's sometimes it's just not worth.
It's just not worth it.
I can tell you a time, and this wasn't even dealing with brethren. And it's not here. So let me just say this. It wasn't brethren. It was somewhere else. I worked for an agency that defrauded me out of a lot of overtime money. Attorney told me to sue. because I could have taken them to the cleaners. And he said, and the numbers he threw out were pretty big numbers. I was like, but that's not even that's way more. He said, oh, no, but we're going to get them for everything that it's costing us. It's going to come out. And I thought about it long and hard of, do I do that or not? Because I accumulated a bunch of comp time, overtime at a certain rate. I put in my resignation and they demoted me so that the guy could take my position, and it had to do with court appearance and that I needed to work out. I chose to do the right thing, and basically it cost me thousands of dollars. And in the end, I chose not to. And the reason I didn't is I knew the news headline would be local preacher sues county. And it would drag the name of that congregation and those people that were associated with it through the mud. And I just, you know what? God's provided. I took the pay that they offered, and I just said, okay, and I talked to a guy that was associated with that later on. They said, well, I never knew that you had such major, that you considered that. And I said, well, it's just not worth it. And I was back visiting these people. I maintained a friendship, and I continue to have a friendship with those people today. I don't think they intentionally meant me malice. I think they just happened to defraud me, and that's okay.
That's called having a kingdom concept. Whenever you understand the concept of the kingdom, you put that as a higher priority above your own personal gain or something like that. That's very, very important.
And so if we can keep that attitude of, I want what's good for the kingdom.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
And that's what obviously they lost in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. It's not trying to deal with the matters, and it can get complicated. What you said, we could 12 days, we could spend 12 hours, 12 days. We could, because, there's some things, it's interesting because you can get into like the law. There's certain things that, even as a deacon over youth, that by law, you're considered a mandatory reporter. That if it comes to your knowledge, that law will, in some states, will consider deacons, elders, preachers within that category of people, that if you come to knowledge, you have to report. And there's some people say, oh, no, we just deal with that in the church. There's some things by law you can't deal with in the church, and so some of that stuff comes out. All right. That was the best biblical legal thing I could bring up, other than the lawyer that came tempting Jesus. We know how those lawyers are.
And he was impressed. Remember, he was quite impressed, and Jesus was impressed with him.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So
he said, "You're not far from the kingdom."